Thank you so much. Yes, I'll say when I was asked how long this was going to be today, I was thinking back of an experience what seems like a lifetime ago. At the very beginning of my university teaching, I got to teach Introduction to Music, non-major course, first year students, and I had 3 sections of it, and they met all in a row. And so it was like 1 p.m., 2 p.m., 3 p.m. So the exact same course, exact same material. And so I always felt bad for people. I felt most confident about the second course, because by then, the first one, you're just trying to find the material and get through it. The second, time around, it's like, yeah, I know what I'm talking about. But the third time, I felt bad for those students, because after, at least I find myself, after I get warmed up, then the stories start flowing, and I find I can't get through the material in an hour. I'm just like, it took me, 40 minutes in the first class and 45 in the second, and then it's already time to go in the third. So anyway, with that, thank you again for the warm welcome, and thank you for being here today. And so in our time together, when I was told the purview of this seminar, I was asked a few years back to prepare something kind of similar with insights for people going into Christian ministries of various sorts from my home discipline of ethnomusicology. So big word for, simple idea, ethnoculture and musicology, study of music. So the study of music as a part of culture is what ethnomusicology does. So anthropology of music, musical anthropology, those are some other terms for it. And so in our time together today, it's my hope that you come away with some new techniques and conceptual tools so that you can better understand the unique congregational music cultures of which you're a part. I think that this idea, as we'll explore it together, has a lot of power in explaining what our congregations do musically in worship, and so introducing this framework, the model of a music culture, I hope will help you interpret the musical practices that you see and hear in new ways. So we're going to apply these insights specifically to Christian congregations, though really any musical setting they'll work. We'll focus on talking through a little bit. I know that some of you, of course, with Rebecca here, I'm sure that many of you have an idea of what ethnography is. For those that haven't taken classes with her, I'll give a kind of a quick and dirty definition. And we will, this seminar is it's about taking a step back from evaluation and first learning to see, or more importantly, to hear more clearly and more comprehensively before we get to evaluation and the kinds of which is necessary, certainly, but sometimes I think we rush to get to the what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, what's beautiful, before seeing and hearing clearly. So we will then work on, in the second part of the session, I'll say the handout that my colleague referred to, we will be looking at that and dividing, and you're going to have to talk in small groups to each other. Nothing scary. Nobody's coming up to the podium or anything, but we'll talk through some of the ideas there. First, let's lay a foundation. Though, if I could have the next slide. Yes. So, this is what I just went over. So we are going to define what music culture and ethnography are, understand how our ideas of culture, because we hear this word thrown around all the time, what does it even mean? Understand how our ideas of culture have changed, identify some of the challenges of understanding our own music cultures, and learn this ethnographic framework for observation, the model of a music culture, and then your job is going to be applying. So, but first let's lay the foundation. So we're looking at music culture through the lenses of the Christian congregation. But what is a congregational music culture, and why does it matter? I think, so when it comes to our churches or our gatherings, our ministries, we know that each local gathering, for worship has its own unique history, geographic location, demographic makeup, and mission. And this is why trying to find a one-size-fits-all approach, which unfortunately we just keep doing over and over again as the Christian church, trying to find these one-size-fits-all models that are going to work, and then when we try to apply them, so often they backfire, especially when it comes to music. So I think as church musicians and leaders and teachers, we need to develop a deep understanding of our congregation's unique music culture in order to knowledgeably to choose wisely to adapt musical resources for worship that engage our congregations holistically, that engage their minds and hearts and spirits. So for our purposes today, I'm going to suggest we define music culture in this way. Next slide, yes. What is a congregational music culture? Okay, it is the unique collection of ideas, activities, repertories, and physical objects, materials that characterizes the music of a local Christian gathering. So if that seems kind of dense and a lot of things packed in there, we will discuss each of these, the ideas, activities, repertories, and materials in what follows. But, so congregational music cultures, they have elements that they share in common, but also characteristics that are totally unique. So it's true that, all of our ideas and activities and repertories and physical, objects will have come from somewhere and probably will be part and parcel of other Christian traditions. And, so I want to go on a little bit of a caveat here and explain some important changes in how we understand culture, kind of what we mean by this, and some older notions that we kind of no longer are referring to. So culture, as some of you might know, that is I would attribute it to anthropologists, but really it was kind of borrowed from, bacterial cultures, like growing things. But anthropologists take this word and they're just like, well, groups of people do a lot of the same things as bacteria. They form colonies, they spread out in different ways, and like each little, again, going with our bacteria metaphor, you have different bacteria growing in each of these cultures, having different characteristics, different elements of them. And so culture was this concept that anthropologists then used to describe the whole set of ideas and practices that were shared by a particular group. But in the latter part of the 20th century, our notions, our ideas about culture began to change. And scientists who studied groups of people thought maybe this, kind of sealed in an environment, way of thinking about culture isn't the best or most accurate way to think about how groups of people interact and how ideas and practices get from one place to the other. They thought that, this model overemphasized what people had in common, and it sometimes made it look like their ideas or practices were more stable or more shared than they actually were. And an intriguing thing happened when more women started to become anthropologists. They found out that sometimes, they came into a culture wherever they went, in the world, and found strikingly different things than other people who had studied that culture. And the question of what's the deal, they found that their predecessors had only talked to the men. And so anthropologists went in, and sometimes admittedly, sometimes there were good reasons for that. Some societies were very segregated, and it would have been, a breach of all kinds of codes to let this strange male figure into gatherings with women in the community. But one of the things that they found is, if we talk to a whole, range of people, we get a very different idea of what animates this group of people, what their values are. And we start to get the idea that maybe these come into conflict more times than not. Generation also started to make a bigger and bigger difference as youth connected with other groups on national and global scales through media and music. So, and then the question of what do we do with population movements like diasporas, or the way culture moves along with people and media, and yeah, I'll say London. I mean, just London. That's really all I need to say as an example there. So, yeah, so culture is far more complex and messy and interesting, I think, than it was given credit for in the old model. So I think the next slide talks about, yeah, kind of these changing ideas of culture, going from, something that is contained, that's relatively static, that's homogeneous, emphasizing these shared aspects, to something that instead is constantly changing, is dynamic, that, yes, preservation and creation of new aspects are part and parcel of culture. And then again, the heterogeneity, the internal and external forces that causing differentiation among members even of the same group, and then tension and struggle. Sometimes I think those of us in ministry, we hear those words and we, oh, tension, struggle. Tension is a terrible thing. Not necessarily. I mean, there are ways that, there are obviously healthy ways to deal with the tension that is going to happen within any group. But so when we're talking about a music culture, we are, using this idea of culture that's kind of over here on the right. So if I could get the next slide. So culture, so to say an animal metaphor here. So culture is something that exists both outside of us and inside of us and all around us. We internalize it, and we help to create it. And people often say that culture is to humans like water is to a fish. And that question of, can a fish ever truly understand what water is if it's in it all the time? And people have also questioned whether people can understand, to what degree can people understand the cultures they're part of? And applying that to our ministry situations, can church ministers and leaders, do we have any hope of understanding our own congregational music cultures when oftentimes the forest can get completely lost in all of the trees looming in front of us? And this is where here, I think I am an optimist. I would say, yes, that fish can understand the water. But part of it involves finding ways to get out of the water, or at least find some different water to be in. And here, so here I want to invoke another common expression, like a fish out of water. So a situation where we feel completely out of our element, like we didn't belong. So even though being a fish out of water is uncomfortable, there are wonderful things that come from it. So by jumping from one bowl into the other, like the little fish on the screen is doing, we learn a lot about things that are very different from us. And moving away from talking about fish and back into ministry, this is why we so often learn a lot about our own congregations when we visit other places. Has anybody experienced that you go to another church and you think, oh, I never would have thought of doing X, Y, and Z. I never would have thought of integrating an instrument that way, or putting a song right here, or doing a responsive reading. I'll say what the chapel worship team did this morning with having us sing "His love endures forever" as a refrain, as we were reading the psalm. I mean, a beautiful, something I learned and we'll take back to my own context. So, observing other congregations and churches help us understand our own by opening our eyes and ears to new possibilities. But, let's be honest, especially if we're in church ministry, we can't just go to other churches all the time and, to try to learn more, more about our own. So in that case, what do we do? What do we do there? What are some obstacles that we face when trying to observe and listen in our own settings? I think next slide. Yeah. So some challenges that we face when trying to look differently, to see differently, to hear differently in those settings that we're really familiar with. One of them, honestly, is proximity, is being too close to something, to a phenomenon. And that's where much of what we will talk about in kind of the second half of my talk here, after we get past the cultural and methodological preliminaries, is how we go about creating some productive distance. And we can do that in a number of ways. My favorite way is through a rubric for structured observation that we try out on all of you, and hope that you kind of enjoy making application. And then, so have lack of tools to produce new insights. I think in some ways, being equipped with tools for new insights is probably, one of the most valuable features of a theological education. You're getting a lot of different tools to put in your toolboxes here. And lack of frameworks, again, frameworks to interpret things differently. I'm giving you another one today. And then sometimes our own, unexamined assumptions or inferences come into things. Again, this is where what I talked about earlier, where I think a lot of times as Christians, we, especially as people preparing for ministry, as leaders, we rush to judgment. We don't give something a chance to sit, maybe go talk to a few other people about, how something struck them. Who knows? Maybe even do some even more social sciencey stuff, like give our congregations, an anonymous survey to collect some data to try to figure out what's going on. So when we're too close to something, again, sometimes we need to create distance. And like a zoom lens for our minds, that helps us go back and forth between being close to something and being further away. And I want to talk about a framework that's going to help us hone our powers of observation, again, specifically when it comes to congregational music and worship. So just like we're borrowing the word culture from social scientists, who I guess borrowed it from bacteriologists, we are going to borrow a series of tools developed by social scientists and music scholars to study culture. If I could get the next slide, please. So anthropologists designed a method, or as we'll see, like a set of related methods known as ethnography. And ethnography is, next slide, one definition, it's a research method. It uses firsthand experience to gain knowledge about a group of people. So the researcher, him or herself, is the tool, is the research tool that's coming, and we see someone who's conducting an interview there. I love a definition that I ran across a few years ago, and then of course I didn't write down where it came from so I could give it the appropriate credit. But let's see, I'll go back to the last slide, please. The art and science of observing and listening. And increasingly, ethnography, at the time that I was kind of getting started doing PhD work and things, it was not as common as it is now. Now there are a number of people conducting theological ethnography. And one of the first people to do that in relationship to music and worship, now if I could have the next slide, please, is Mary McGann. So Mary McGann is an American Catholic theologian, also a musicologist in liturgical studies worship, and she's got, I would commend to you, this excellent little book, written, I think, 2002, 20 years ago now, but every bit as relevant. It's also, for those of you, thinking, oh, one more book, it's also very short. It's got like 3 or 4 chapters. It's 120 pages, something like that. So nice, short book. But she talks about the goals of ethnography in her book, Exploring Music as Worship and Theology, as to develop sustained, detailed, and polyvocal descriptions of musical performance rooted in the understandings and categories of those who perform. So again, needing to, not just kind of sit by yourself and your own counsel. It's about engaging like these people are in musical traditions and learning from others. And so if I could get the next slide. ethnographic methods, there are a lot of different methods and different projects that I've done with research has called for different emphases on these. And so, but the toolbox generally includes interviewing, observation, and the ones in bold are the ones we're going to talk more about today. Free and structured observation, participation, so going in and not just sitting on the sidelines, but as the community allows you, learning how to perform their music, learning how to sing in whatever style that you're studying, surveys, and then documentation of various kinds. And I will say also that ethnographic methods, they play well with other kinds of methods. Again, theological ethnography, using these in parallel to theological reflection and putting it in dialogue with people within the theological tradition. Also, in my field in ethnomusicology, oftentimes ethnographic methods are put together with musicological, with transcribing, in notation, what people are doing and kind of dealing with the sound materials as well. So, two kinds of observations, what I'm calling free observation and structured observation. So free observation, which, can be helpful up to a point, is kind of the observation that we do most of the time. When we set aside time, we're just like, I'm going to watch and see what happens. And so, an example of free observation in, your church service would be to go in and jot down what stands out to you. Another kind of fun thing to do is role playing, and I'm not talking about don't say that I told you to go LARPing in your in your church or anything, but role play like, if I were a first-time visitor walking into this space, I'm going to go sit somewhere I wouldn't ordinarily sit, and I'm going to kind of take on a different mindset. That can also be a useful thing to do, but that's useful kind of up to a point. But a lot of times, it's helpful, but it has limitations. Sometimes we don't know what to look for, or we simply hear what we want to hear or what we expected to hear. And this is where having a framework to guide our observations is so helpful. We are to the model of a music culture. If you could please go on here. So in the definition that I gave you a little bit earlier, you'll notice these same words, reoccurring: ideas, activities, repertories, and material culture. But let me tell you a little bit about this tool and kind of the history of it and why I think it's so applicable to congregations. So ethnomusicologist Jeff Todd Titan, who is a professor emeritus at Brown University in the U.S., he had a he continues to write and publish and research even in his retirement. But throughout his distinguished career, Professor Titan researched a variety of, he started out looking at American folk and religious musics. And some of his most well-known work is from a close ethnographic study of a small Baptist congregation in the rural United States in the Appalachian Mountains. And so his ideas, what I think is neat about that is he's, he would not identify as a Christian, but so many of his models came out of the study of the church. So in some ways, I feel like it's just kind of bringing the model back, back home to apply what came out of his study of a church initially back to into the congregation. So his model is this: he says there are ideas about music. So these include beliefs about music, aesthetic preferences, contexts, and histories. Activities involving music making, and so a lot of the activities involve who is involved, questions of, who leads, who is allowed to lead, who's on center stage, who's elsewhere, what kinds of performing groups, do you have in your congregation? Is there a worship team and a choir and kazoo ensemble? I don't know. I enjoy seeing that, if anybody has one. Repertories. So this component includes characteristics of the music like style, genre, text, as well as processes of, so how did people come up with it? How did they compose it? Did they compose it on the spot as the result of the inspiration of the Spirit? Did they, work on it in staff notation for 6 months before it was ready to be used in a service? And then, of course, transmission. How did the music get to the people? Did people come to the service already knowing the songs or expecting to hear, certain things because they've been listening to them, sharing them on social media or listening to them on the radio throughout the week? So the last component is material culture, and this refers to the tangible, the physical objects that are required to create or perform or transmit the music. So musical instruments are probably the most obvious aspects of material culture within a music culture, but of course there are so many more other significant parts. These include printed materials like hymn books or song books, electronic media like screens, projectors, amplifiers, microphones. I mean, anything that's used as a material object, as a physical object to make music. And you could include in the materials category, the built environment itself, because we know that of course has major effects on what happens in a space. Perhaps you want a choir in the back, but there's nowhere to put the choir in the back. Or like you want to put in my church, it's like if we ever want the choir to sing in the front, we'd have to move the first couple of pews because there's no room in the space for them in the front. So those are the 4 main categories, but there are a lot of subcategories under each of these. And this is where, say, my lovely assistant that has the handouts here, this is where I'll say when you get a handout, see, I will decide how to divide you all up. So what you'll see on the front of the handout is basically what I just told you, is an explanation of kind of what a music culture is and why it might be, what the each of the components are. But for this part of of our time together, I'd like you to participate. We're going to take just a few minutes. I've got some some ideas to wrap up about each of these sections, but would like to hear, from you all. I won't cold call anybody, but in the ideas about music section. So they were looking at questions about the church's beliefs about music. So like, what is music? What is music supposed to do as part of worship? About church members' aesthetic ideals. Their sense of what's good or beautiful or pleasing, and whether or not that shifts depending on the group that you're talking to, what aspects define the context, and then what sources chronicle the history. And every church, no matter if it was founded a month ago, or 500 years ago, has sources that chronicle the history, whether or not those are written, or whether it's, someone, with an oral history with the knowledge of, how things were under so-and-so, vicar, and then how they changed under, X, Y, and Z. So what was just an insight? Does anybody have an insight about ideas that inform, that are embedded within congregational worship that struck you, that you thought was interesting, that you want to share?
There's the idea that, generally speaking, if music was written more than about 5 years ago, it's likely to be worthless.
Ooh. Okay. Yeah. So there were some kind of cringing recognition there.
I think the organ chronicles the history of the church in some places, and whether it's still played or not.
Yes. So learning history from material culture. I'll say you're ahead of things. You're linking the two there. Yeah. Any other insights about ideas?
Yeah, the concept that even if you don't have a formal liturgy, in reality you have developed a liturgy.
Yes. Yes, we will be, I'll be talking about that a little bit in the lecture a little bit later on. Yes, the Pentecostal liturgy, which is not a word. I'll say some Pentecostals are comfortable with that word, but yeah, so ideas, one of the most powerful ideas, and something that I bring up in my classes when I'm teaching this model, is talking about differences between how certain theologians have approached music and how this has led to certain branches off in the Christian musical tradition. So thinking about, say, John Calvin versus Martin Luther on music, right? They are very quotable, say both of them, on their ideas and opinions about music, just kind of paint with very, very broad strokes. Martin Luther believed that music was a gift from God, second only to the Word, and that therefore music as a gift from God should be encouraged in all of its variety and permutations, and let's do folk music, classical music, just anything. Not anything, but I'll say within there were still boundaries. I mean, even for Luther there were boundaries. But polyphony, orchestra, all of the instruments of the church. Whereas for Calvin, music was a human creation rather than a divine gift, a human creation, and as we know, humans have fallen. And so a human creation kind of emphasizing that doctrine of the fall, and it's just like music can too easily become an idol. Look at those Catholics, look at those, popish, figures where they're singing and you can't understand what they're saying, and music can become an idol in and of itself. And so for Calvin was like, nope, no instruments in churches. This is why so much of, early Reformed history, there weren't instruments. And harmony as well. Harmony, they kind of went back and forth on that one, but harmony even could be, that might detract, that might distract. People might be listening to the music more than they are, appreciating and believing the words. So let's sing in unison, just to be safe. So doctrine of the fall versus doctrine of creation, those beliefs animated huge differences between, musical traditions of the Reformation. Yeah. So activities group back here. Were there any interesting insights that came out from thinking about the division of labor within the church's music making, or whether gender, ethnicity, class, or age affect how people participate in the music?
Thanks. We were reflecting, as we mentioned, in smaller congregations, you're very limited as to what choices you have. So the person who turns up and can play the piano or the guitar, if you don't have anybody else, they're automatically into the spot. So, then all these secondary considerations about, what type of music they want to play even, or, the gender, ethnicity, class, etc., are sort of secondary to the fact that they're there and they can play an instrument. So that, just the material culture, I guess the link between that and everything else is sort of brought home in a very small congregation, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Nice. For convenience. I guess we had a range of sizes in our group in regards to the church. So one of the things we were talking about in division of labor is like paid versus unpaid staffing positions. A lot of the larger churches have very much like directors of worship, paid worship leaders, and then worship teams who may or may not be paid. So yeah, and then some of our members had smaller churches where it was the same. Do you know how to play a piano? Fantastic. So we're talking about the range.
Yes.
And status could be indicated by where you place your musicians, to what extent they are able to, as it were, dominate, control the congregation, and what you dress them up in.
Yeah. What you dress them up in, or what they choose to dress themselves in. In case.
So we have a big and varied dressing up box.
Excellent.
We had some conversations, again, thinking about range, about leadership, how leadership is understood. Is it well, generally, I think it is more understood as the person who's leading the singing, but can someone who's playing an instrument also lead? And if so, how do they lead? And also a range of one person dominating the leadership of the whole service, preaching and choosing the songs and everything, to right at the other end of the spectrum, nobody apparently leading, although still having a structure where people get up and individually choose songs, but even within that, in that situation, it was men and women weren't allowed to. So, yeah.
Yeah, so many questions, and I love all of these, and of course, as we'll see, they go together, but I think some of those questions of activities, I heard in one of the groups, someone mentioned, in fact, explicitly that, these, questions of power really come to the fore here, in the who participates. What does it mean, for instance, if 98% of your church's musicians are women, but all the leaders are men? What does it mean if there's never anyone over age 30 on the stage, or if there's never anyone under age 60 on the stage? So these signify, profoundly, these activities, some of the ideas that are underlying the worship. Great. All right. So the spread out group talking about repertories of music. You all had a whole lot of questions, about the music, style characteristics, genre texts. How's the music composed, transmitted, learned? Are there particular movements? I heard a lot of interesting conversation about movement or lack thereof from some of the groups over here. So we've got a couple of minutes. Any insights to share?
So I recounted a story very briefly of somebody that went to my dad's church, and they called me. And they asked if I knew such and such, and I said yes, and I asked quite hesitantly why. And it was because apparently this individual, who was very Pentecostal in his worship, was reprimanded by the leadership of my dad's church because they were dancing in the aisles and they were making a lot of noise, especially in the slower songs. And so that kind of pointed to me that at the very least, different expressions of worship that would fit in other denominational contexts were either at the very least awkward in other denominational contexts, but at the most extreme were very unwelcome. And I know for this individual in particular, but I guess as a kind of a general principle, as a result of this experience, the individual or individuals would feel as if their freedom of expression as per their worship would be impinged upon. And I think that is a significant thing, because it kind of points to a wider way in which we understand kind of the nature of worship and how it's expressed in our different contexts.
Yeah, great example. Other insights?
We sort of rattled through a whistle-stop tour of most of the questions and points, but we did dwell on the improvisatory nature of music in a worship context for a little bit. And through that discussion, we kind of came up with the common ground that, okay, Matt isn't here anymore, but Matt is the worship pastor at Emmanuel. I'm worship pastor at a different church. And we have very different congregations and very different experiences. And the congruent thing that was congruent between the both of us, and actually the other people in our groups, their experiences as well, was that we have a sort of fixed way of, these are songs we do, and we would sing these songs with these words because they are congruent with the church's theology and with the way the church thinks and acts. But then what we were trying to do is discuss what are ways that we can facilitate spontaneity and improvisation in worship without it becoming empty or vain. And that was a great conversation that we had, which took a while, but yeah, that was great.
Great. Yes, because so many of these things that we assume are polar opposites, of course, I mean, your comments, they can exist simultaneously and together and enhance one another. Absolutely. Well, it sounds like a lot was learned in these conversations, so I was like, give yourselves a hand for the discussion, for the peer-to-peer teaching that went on here. The material culture of music, and what I find interesting is kind of laced throughout so many of these comments, material culture kept coming up again and again. And one of the things I like best about this model, and one of the most powerful things about the Titan model, is that it describes a dynamic system. So in other words, when one of the four components, and if you'll scoot forward, I think I've got I think for whatever reason in this presentation, I have like 3 slides that do largely the same thing. So components of, a music culture. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you, if you like acronyms, so I arm you with this model of looking for ideas, activities, repertories, materials, right? But the beautiful thing about it is that about it as an explanatory model is oftentimes when one of these things changes, it creates a ripple effect through the whole system. And so we've heard of examples of, and I'm sure that, if we had more time to, talk about it, we could all come up with examples of how, for instance, when the materials change, when my rural southern United States, Baptist church built a new building, they decided to put in screens, because our old one, it had a screen, but it was kind of ratty and it was difficult for everybody to see, so we didn't use it very often. But when the screens came, I found kind of slowly the song repertory began to change. All of a sudden, when you didn't have to use the blue hymnal for everything, the music minister found, we can do this vineyard stuff that's coming out, probably some of it from your country. And so, I grew up not having any idea who John Wimber was or what the vineyard was, and, singing these vineyard songs because my, music minister had encountered them somewhere and kind of slipped them in amongst the Fanny Crosby in that. But that's just one example of many of how, materials change, repertories change, activities involving music. Once you have these new styles, it wasn't too long after that the choir was supplemented with a worship band, eventually replaced entirely by the worship band. David, do you have a observation?
Just that whole, what's sometimes called playlist phenomenon where it's a bit of a stereotype, but if you've grown up on Spotify or iTunes, that sense of chronology goes, because you'll, if my 20-something kids will readily listen to Joni Mitchell alongside Taylor Swift, they don't think of them being 50 years apart.
Yes.
And I think what screens have done, as they've superseded hymn books, is that they've stopped us locating a particular piece of music in a particular era. So where I grew up, we had Congregational Praise, which was the Blue Book, which was the old traditional hymns, Isaac Watts, John Wesley, all the rest of it. And then we had the thing called New Church Praise, which was the Red Book, and that was Fred Pratt Green and Sidney Carter and people like that were 60s, 70s. We knew that was like signified as modern. You could tell from the music that there was a distinction. But today, with YouTube and Spotify and all the rest of it, making their way, in a sense, into modern music on screens, I think a lot of people just can't locate where a tune comes from. That don't distinguish a hymn from the 18th century from something written 20 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah, to some extent the musical genre will give it away, but the arrangements of a Wesley hymn can be a modern,
that's right,
very modern. So it's much harder to tell, I think. That's one thing that's gone.
And also your comment there reminded me of a funny moment in a worship conference, I won't say which one, a worship conference in the U.S. That I was in, where a speaker in front of, as I recall, several hundred people made a comment about, the heritage. I forget what exactly he said about In Christ Alone, but implying that it was one of the beloved hymns of the faith, hundreds of years old or something like that. Thinking, yes, exactly. But that's your point is your point is well taken. That a lot of times that's a change that some of the materials have had, is the bringing in of multiple repertories and the kind of flattening of some of these distinctions, probably for good and for bad. So my very last slide, I think. Oh, there we go. Is just the why. Okay, so why use this for structured observation of your own congregations? And again, I find that these categories give neutral language for talking about difficult situations. You can talk about there being differences in aesthetics or differences in the ideas that people have without again, saying, this is bad and I don't like it. And we need to change it. Sometimes we need descriptive language to supplement our evaluative language. Or my favorite one, and please don't do this, I don't know if you do this, is just that song is bad theology. Like theology is this qualitative thing, that it becomes it becomes kind of a club that that stops conversation. You can just say that's poor theology. It's bad. Why? What ideas are being expressed? That you don't agree with, or that you find unscriptural or unbiblical, or whatever else. Or did you just hear somebody else say that that song was theologically thin? Anyway, just a pet peeve right there. I'll get off that soapbox. So the music culture model enables you to imagine a range of possibilities for music in your congregation. So once you kind of go through the rubric and think, okay, well, I guess we do don't do a lot of improvisation, but like this group over here was talking about, what are some ways that we can do that in alignment with the ideas that we have, the beliefs that we have about music and the way that God works through it. Then it helps you envision the implications, I think, of changing any one aspect of your congregational singing or your worship. Just knowing that a change to one of these areas, thinking through, okay, we're going to make this repertory change, but is that going to shift in any way our congregation's beliefs? And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you're trying to shepherd people in a certain direction, or maybe that's somewhere that you don't want to go. So maybe you save that song for a different season. And then finally, it points out, I think it's useful for Christian leaders in particular, because it points out discrepancies or contradictions in musical ideas or practices that need to be dealt with. When we go through the rubric and we say, okay, so we say that, our church strives to be, say, inclusive across generations or across ethnic groups. But then when we look at our repertories, 98% of the songs that we sing are fill in the blank. Are our repertory choices, are those in line with the ideas that we're professing? So I think that helps. It helps leaders to bring all of these aspects in line. So. Yes, so that's what I've got for you today. Thank you for participating and for being here. I'll see some of you in about an hour and a half. So, thank you.